him and court system. People pouring in bad. Let's get to CNN's Jessica Schneider, who is live outside President Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida. Jessica, we know that Trump's lawyers at the Department of Justice have been careful to not mention or bring up some of his more inflammatory tweets in court. Clearly, that is not stopping him.
That's right. You know, President Trump's Twitter tirade yesterday, it did raise eyebrows. It prompted condemnation. It was silent this morning. No tweets this morning. But just in the past few minutes, President Trump is back at it again, as you saw in that first tweet, once again targeting the judicial system. Just a few minutes ago, he did put out a second tweet, once again casting his ire onto the courts and talking about Homeland Security. Here's what he said. He said, "I have instructed Homeland Security to check people coming into our country very carefully. The courts are making the job very difficult." Of course, Donald Trump referring there to the courts in general, but it was yesterday where he unleashed on Twitter, specifically targeting the federal judge in Seattle, James Robart, calling him a, quote, so-called judge, calling his ruling, quote, ridiculous. Of course, this is unheard of, really, for a sitting president to be criticizing a federal judge. It's prompted a lot of pushback, a lot of concern, both among Republicans and Democrats. House Speaker Paul Ryan, though, sort of dancing around the issue, choosing to stay above the fray, talking only about policy, saying that he doesn't really pay attention to tweets and social media. But earlier today, we did hear from Vice President Mike Pence and what he had to say about it, about this travel ban, about the executive order, and about this legal process. He put a very fine point on it, not elaborating much, but he said that he is confident that the travel ban would be upheld. But despite that, President Trump once again this afternoon taking to Twitter and targeting the judicial system. Boris?
All right, Jessica Schneider, thank you. Joining us now to talk more about this, CNN Global Affairs analyst Aaron David Miller and CNN legal analyst Danny Savalos. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Danny, to you first. The Department of Justice is trying to make the case that blocking the executive order immediately harms the American public. What evidence would they use to make that case, to make that argument?
The idea behind the DOJ's argument is that the executive branch has not only the inherent power under the Constitution, but under federal law, and those two things vest the executive branch with the power to exclude people that it deems a threat from the United States who are seeking to come into the country. And they cite a number of cases and prior occasions where the president has exercised that power and has exercised it validly. The plaintiff, on the other hand, argues in this case, the state of Washington, that these actions are racially motivated, religiously motivated, such that they violate not only the Constitution, but actual federal law, which prohibits this kind of discrimination.
Aaron, to you, there has to be, let's say, apprehension among world leaders when it comes to dealing with the United States when they see this legal battle that's unfolding here and some of the rhetoric that has come from candidate and then President Donald Trump. How does the world view what's unfolding with this travel ban right now?
You know, where you stand, Boris, has a lot to do with where you sit. So I'm sure there are certain world leaders that admire the president's tough, muscular approach, and which reflects a certain populist nationalism. And there are others, certainly, Prime Minister of Iraq, heads of many Muslim countries, although the Saudis and the Egyptians, since they're not on the list of restricted countries of the 7, have said very little about this. You know, I'm not a lawyer, Boris, and I don't want to play one on TV, but I think that the central point about the executive order is this. Is it designed to actually make Americans safer? And the reality is the data simply doesn't support it. I mean, you don't have a single refugee admitted since 1980 under the Refugee Act that has been implicated in a fatal terrorist attack against Americans here at home. The 7 countries, none of the citizens or their parents of these countries have been implicated in terror here as well. The real threat we face is homegrown terror. And that is carried out largely by permanent legal residents or American citizens, some of whom have been in this country for many years. So I think that's the real question. I can't argue the point with Danny. He's a very talented lawyer. But I think in terms of the foreign policy implications, the data simply doesn't support the fact that this executive order is going to cause harm to the American public.
To be fair, Aaron, there were 2 Iraqi men arrested in Kentucky back in 2011 that were not planning a domestic terror attack, but they were aiding terrorist cells overseas, and that's part of the reason that President Obama put that temporary ban on Iraqi refugees coming to the United States, or at least having them be re-vetted. To you, Danny, now, the Department of Justice has revealed a little bit about how they plan to argue the case. Do you think one of their efforts is going to be to say that the judge in this case doesn't have the standing to execute this order nationwide?
Well, they're going to argue standing primarily against the state of Washington, that the state of Washington does not have standing on behalf of its citizens or other visa holders or Americans or any of the people they purport to sue on behalf of. Because the state of Washington simply doesn't have an interest in the outcome. It doesn't have the speculative effect of this order doesn't rise to that legal level of having a concrete interest in the outcome, and that is standing. The idea behind standing is that you can't just have a theoretical interest and open the courthouse doors and start suing people. Now, of course, the state of Washington says it has a very real concrete interest because these citizens, these people, are immediately affected by this executive order and they're immediately harmed. And the state of Washington is in a situation that it can bring this and have standing.
Now, Aaron, you touched on some of this earlier, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Yesterday, the president tweeted, quote, "It's interesting that certain Middle Eastern countries agree with the ban. They know that if certain people are allowed in, it's death and destruction." First, do you know which Middle Eastern countries he's talking about?
I mean, again, there are several obvious candidates. Perhaps he was referring to. I mean, of the four countries that provided hijackers in 9/11, all 4 are not on the list: Lebanon, the UAE, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, and the Saudis. And the Egyptians and the Saudis, in large part because we have tremendous foreign policy equities in these 2 countries. Both Abdel Fattah Sisi, the president of Egypt, and none of the Saudi royals have commented negatively on this, even though many in the Muslim and Arab world consider this ban to be discriminatory. So I suspect he was thinking about those 2 for sure.
And from your perspective, why wouldn't they be included if 16 of the 19 September 11th hijackers came from Saudi Arabia?
You know, that's an interesting question. Why are the 7 countries on the list? The Trump administration argued quite logically that these were the 7 countries of concern that first emerged. 3 of them, Sudan, Syria, and Iran, are classified as state sponsors of terror. Others, such as Libya, Somalia, and Yemen, have lost control of their territory, and transnational jihadi groups are operating, and ISIS is operating. So there's a certain logic in referring to what the Obama administration has done, paradoxically, in some respects, to use the previous administration as cover for denoting these 7 countries.
All right, Aaron David Miller and Danny Savalos, we have to leave it there. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you, Boris.
Next, a Trump surrogate weighs in on the travel ban and the legal fight ahead. Can the Trump White House survive in court?